Welcome to the Dusty Discipleship Podcast. In Jesus' day, the disciples hoped to follow their rabbi so closely that it was said that they would be covered in the dust of their rabbi's feet. And that's what we want. We want to follow Jesus so closely, learn his way of life, and become people shaped by the words, his kingdom, and his presence. Last episode, we talked through Matthew chapter 11, and we ended with one of the most beautiful invitations I think that Jesus ever gives. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And if you're anything like me, that sounds wonderful, but it also raises a question. What kind of rest is Jesus talking about? Because most of us know what it feels like to stop working, but not to actually rest. We take a day off and still be anxious. We can sit on the couch and feel unsettled. We can have a quieter schedule and still carry a noisy soul. So when Jesus says, I will give you rest, he's not just saying take a nap. He's inviting us into something much deeper. He's inviting us into the rest humanity was made for from the beginning. Life with God, under God's rule, and in God's good world. And I think that's why Matthew 12 matters so much. Matthew does not accidentally put Jesus' invitation to rest at the end of chapter 11 and then immediately move into Sabbath stories in chapter 12. I think Matthew wants us to see the connection. Jesus says, come to me and find rest. And then Matthew shows us what happens when the Lord of the Sabbath stands in front of restless people. So today, let's walk through Matthew 12 and think about this big idea. Jesus is the rest Sabbath was always pointing towards. And Matthew 12 shows us what his rest confronts, restores, frees, fills, and invites us into. My name is Mitch. I'm excited to talk with you about the Bible today. Let's jump on in. Welcome back to the Dusty Discipleship Podcast, episode 12. And maybe what is the most ironic of at least the episodes I have done so far, I would ask you to excuse my voice. It has been a crazy hectic week. Over the last 7 or so days, I have just been go, go, go. And finally, about 2 days ago, my body was just like, I don't think you need to go anymore. And I was able to just get a good night's sleep on Tuesday night. It's currently Thursday evening, and I was able to get just a really good night's sleep Tuesday night. And even last night, I took, a lot longer than I normally do to sleep. Normally, I try to get 8 hours if possible, and I've tried to be as religious as I can with my sleep. And I don't think I had been. I hope your week is going much better, but on a week where we're going to talk about rest, I think I'm finally getting to the point where I'm a bit caught up on my rest. And so hopefully you've had more of a restful week than I have. But here we are, Matthew chapter 12, talking about Sabbath rest. As we're going through these chapters in the Bible, finding out more and more how hard it is to try to just nail down a chapter with a theme. And there's just so much richness in the Bible, and really you could go in some cases verse by verse. And because we're doing chapter by chapter, we're kind of just trying to explore through these different themes and trying to find overarching themes. And there's just so much here. This chapter is big on a few things. It's big on mercy. I think there's a lot of mercy shown in these, especially here in chapter 12. Excuse me, you might hear a bit of a sip. I am trying to drink with some hot tea, and hopefully my voice will make it through the next 25 or so minutes. But Matthew 12 really does. I think it highlights mercy. It highlights a few other things, but I think the story is just so blatantly pointing to rest or to Sabbath. We couldn't ignore it this time through. And if this podcast continues and it just feels like something the Lord continues to want me to do, and we come through Matthew a second time, I'm sure we'll start to explore some other themes. But before we get into Matthew 12, I want to take a step back, and maybe this might be the first time we've done this so far, and I want to talk about the rest of the Bible and just the idea that Sabbath is a big part of the Bible. And it doesn't just start with the Ten Commandments, because Sabbath does start at the beginning of the Bible, first page of the Bible. You see, God creates for 6 days. He brings order out of chaos, or you could say maybe he brings light out of darkness, or he puts life into empty spaces. Then on the seventh day, God rests. And I think it's important to make the distinction that God is not tired. That's not the point of pointing out that God rested. The point is that creation had reached his goal. God had ordered the world as a place where his presence can dwell with humans who are going to bear his image, and God rests in that. And humanity is placed in that garden to live with him, to work with God, and to rule with him. Biblical rest is not about laziness. It's not about escaping. It's about creation functioning the way God intended us to. Maybe a helpful way for us to think about that would be by using two Hebrew words. And you may have heard these before. I try to pronounce Hebrew words at least somewhat phonetically. With my voice being as weak as it is tonight, I don't know how well that'll do. But the first Hebrew word that I think really centers around rest is Shabbat. Shabbat. And that is where we get the word Sabbath. And it means to stop. It means to stop. It means to stop what you're doing and something like that. The second word has a bit more of what you're expecting with those Hebrew words, and that's nuach. Nuach. And it kind of has that hard sound there at the end. And nuach means to settle, to dwell, or maybe a better way to put it would be like resting in place. And so as we talk about Sabbath and rest, it's not just about stopping. It's about stopping so that you can settle into God's presence. That matters, I think, for a lot of us because so often we stop without settling. Many of us will have the day off and still be striving. We can stop working and still be striving. We can stop producing, but still maybe be trying to prove. Or you can stop moving, but still be restless. I don't know about you, but so often I take time off only to find that I'm more tired at the end of my time off than I was at the beginning. And I'm legendary for taking vacations that are so chock full of excitement that often I need a vacation from my vacation. Or maybe as I was thinking about this, I was reminded just about how many times I've gone, and then went to actually lay down on my bed. My legs are so restless, I can't actually rest. And that is stopping without settling. And the Bible's vision of rest is deeper than just not being active. It's life settled under God's good rule. But humanity forfeits that rest. At the beginning of the Bible, we choose our own wisdom. We grasp for the fruit and we leave the garden and we enter a world that is said to be full of toil and anxiety and fear, exile, slavery, death. And then as we move through the Bible, God gives Israel Sabbath as a weekly practice of trust. He tells them that every seventh day, I want you to stop. I want you to stop producing and stop striving. I want you to stop acting like you're owned by Pharaoh. I want you to stop acting like everything depends on you. And I want you to remember that I'm your creator. Remember that I'm your redeemer. I want you to remember that you were slaves once, and God set you free. And Sabbath will expand into Israel with the idea of Sabbath years, where you will do certain things and have rest in certain ways for years. And then you will have something called the Jubilee, which you see more as you get into the prophets, where it's supposed to be a time where debts are forgiven, slaves are released, land is restored, and families are brought home. And so a lot of the Old Testament shows that Sabbath really is a signpost. It's supposed to point people forward to the day when God will restore all things. And so it's no coincidence that Jesus then arrives in Matthew 11 and says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." It's not just a random comfort verse. It's not a verse that I think you're supposed to hang above your bed and just feel good about. It's a kingdom announcement. Jesus is really saying the rest you were made for is found in me. And so Matthew 12 opens with Jesus and his disciples walking through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And Jesus will begin to show us what rest will look like in our real life. And in the story, the disciples are hungry, and so they pick heads from the grain and they eat them. The Pharisees see it, and as so often, they look to catch something and see and tell Jesus that their disciples are doing something that's not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. This is important. The disciples are hungry, and the Pharisees are watching for violations. I think that can tell us a lot. You see, Sabbath was supposed to be a gift. It was supposed to remind Israel that they weren't slaves anymore. But in the hands of the Pharisees, I think Sabbath had become another burden to carry. And Jesus responds to the Pharisees by pointing back to King David, pointing back to the priests, the temple. He points back to Hosea when he says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And then Jesus says this interesting statement. He says, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is not anti-Sabbath. He's not saying that you shouldn't observe Sabbath. Instead, he's saying you cannot understand Sabbath if you don't understand me. The Lord of the Sabbath is standing right in front of them, and the Pharisees are using Sabbath to accuse hungry disciples. And I think this is what happens when religion becomes religion without relationship. Or maybe you could say it more like rest has become religion without relationship. Sabbath just became another burden to carry, and we missed the Lord of the Sabbath. And as I was reading that first story, I thought of just how many times I feel tired because I'm carrying a burden Jesus never placed on me. Not all of my tiredness comes because I'm rebellious or because I'm carrying something that Jesus gave me and I don't want to. More often than not, I'm tired because I'm carrying the expectations of religion and people's opinions and a fear of failure and constant comparison and the pressure to prove that I'm enough, I'm spiritually enough, I'm physically enough. And Jesus doesn't say in the chapter before, come to me and I'm going to give you a heavier yoke. He says, come to me and I'm going to give you rest. And so in this first section, Jesus brings rest, I think, from religious burdens. And I think for a lot of us, that's a heavy weight. I've had a lot of conversations with church members over the last few weeks. And so much of it was just, yeah, that's just how we grew up. Yeah, that's just kind of what we've always known. I think of just my own past in a more conservative denomination of Christianity that just struggled mightily with legalism and with standards and making those standards on par with the Word of God. And there's nothing wrong with having standards, but when those standards become a religious burden, you miss the Lord of the Sabbath. And so in this first section, Jesus brings rest from religious burdens. And then Matthew gives us a second Sabbath story. And it's that Jesus doesn't ignore brokenness. And this kind of made me think back to, I think it was Matthew 8. But Jesus looks to restore. Jesus enters a synagogue, and there stands a man with a withered hand. And the Pharisees ask, kind of knowing what Jesus is doing, and say, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Listen to the question. They're not asking, how can we help this man, or what would God's heart be for him, or is this technically allowed? Jesus is coming in, and they're asking if Jesus can heal on the Sabbath. And Jesus answers by giving this just masterful example of a sheep falling into a pit and saying, if one of your sheep had fallen into a pit on the Sabbath, they would lift it out. And he says, how much more value is a man than a sheep? And he tells the man to stretch out his hand, and the man's restored. And what Jesus is doing here, first of all, is I think he's just masterfully pointing out that the priority of the people in the synagogue or in the tabernacle there was not on themselves, or it was on themselves and not on the man, which is just not the heart of God whatsoever. But Sabbath also what Jesus is showing us is that Sabbath is not being inactive just so you can be inactive. It's about restoration. Jesus doesn't break Sabbath. He's fulfilling its deepest meaning. If Sabbath points us to creation being restored, then of course, Jesus is going to heal on the Sabbath. That's what Sabbath was always pointing towards. Bodies being restored, people being made whole, creation being set right. And the rest of Jesus, like the rest, capital rest of Jesus, doesn't ignore what's withered. It restores it. And so you have to think about your own rest in your life. Is it making you more compassionate? If it's not the rest of Jesus. Biblical rest is not being selfish and withdrawing. It's not saying, I'm resting so I don't have to care. The rest Jesus brings us opens our eyes to people. It restores the withered. And then the Pharisees begin by plotting to destroy Jesus. And Jesus withdraws. And Matthew then takes us into the next movement, showing us the kind of king that Jesus is going to be, or maybe the kind of king Jesus is, or really is. And Matthew will now quote here in these next 5 or 6 verses. He'll say from the book of Isaiah that, "Behold, my servant whom I have chosen. The servant will not quarrel or cry aloud. He will not break a bruised reed. He will not quench a smoldering wick until he brings justice to victory." I paraphrase that a bit, but really it's a beautiful line of it's not really poetry, but it's really just a beautiful line of literature. Jesus isn't fragile, but he is gentle. He's not weak, but he's tender. Jesus is strong enough to bring justice to victory, but gentle enough not to crush the bruised reed. And that bruised reed phrasing really does matter, because a bruised reed is already damaged. A smoldering wick is barely burning. And Matthew says that Jesus knows how to handle people like that. He doesn't break what is already bruised. He doesn't snuff out what's barely burning. And I think that that connects directly to Matthew 11, where Jesus says, "I am gentle and lowly in heart." Rest that Jesus brings us is so personal. I think some of us might be tired because of religious burdens. Maybe we're tired because we're withered. But there's others of us that are tired because we are bruised and barely burning. And Jesus is gentle enough for that. He's gentle enough for the fragile people, but he's also strong enough to bring justice to victory. And in this third section here, we see that rest begins when we stop pretending that we're not bruised. Some of us are still trying to perform strength when Jesus is inviting us to bring him our weakness. You don't have to be a roaring fire to come to Jesus. You can be a smoldering wick. You don't have to be unbroken to come to Jesus. You can be a bruised reed. Excuse me. But Matthew doesn't just finish there. He doesn't let us reduce rest to just like maybe a quiet feeling inside. Instead, I think he continues on by also showing that Jesus' rest is also liberation. In this next story, Jesus is brought a demon-possessed man who's blind and mute, and Jesus heals him. And the man speaks and sees. And that is rest. It's rest, maybe not like vacation or schedule, but it's rest from bondage. It's liberation. The man is bound, and Jesus sets him free. The people are around and begin to ask, can this be the son of David? Or they're really trying to connect Jesus to the Messiah. And the Pharisees say it's only by Beelzebul, or only by the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons. Think about how dark that is. The Pharisees watch a man being freed, healed, restored, and they call it demonic. And Jesus will respond back to what is a famous saying, especially here in America, as it's something that Abraham Lincoln said, by saying that a house or a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. And then he gives an image of binding the strong man, saying, if someone's going to go rob a strong man's house, you first have to tie up the strong man. And Jesus says, that's what I'm doing. I'm confronting the powers that keep people captive. And this is where Sabbath connects to Jubilee. Remember when I said Jubilee early in the episode was this time of restoring the land and paying off debts and setting slaves free. Rest is not just personal peace. Rest is release. Rest is freedom. Rest is captives set free. Rest is people restored to God, people being restored to themselves and to community. Jesus gives rest by confronting the powers that steal rest. This also helps us, I think, handle what Jesus talks about next, where he says that we have to be careful about blaspheming the Spirit. This passage is not aimed at tender-hearted people who are afraid they have gone too far, but it's aimed at the hardened people who see the freeing work of God's Spirit through Jesus and call it evil. Their words reveal their hearts. Jesus says a tree is known by its fruit, and the mouth speaks from the overflow of the heart. Being restless is not just about our schedules. Sometimes it's about what has power over us. Fear binds us and shame ties us up. Sin leaves us in handcuffs and accusations leaves us just wrapped in vines and rope. The need for control binds us, and the constant suspicion of others leaves us just fully in bondage. And Jesus doesn't just give better time management. He's offering freedom under the rule of a stronger king. And the Pharisees, in just much of the way they do, ask for a sign. And I think this next section really does show us another kind of restlessness. A restless heart that maybe keeps demanding that God prove himself while missing what he's already doing. And so if we said at the beginning that, if we said at the beginning that rest is a picture all the way throughout the Bible, and at the beginning of the chapter, Jesus shows us that he gives us rest from the religious burden, that rest should be restoring, that rest is for those who are bruised and smoldering, but rest also can look like liberation from the powers that are binding us. And as that happens, they ask for a sign. The scribes and Pharisees will say, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." And that sounds reasonable. I think I used to read some of these verses sometimes like, oh, come on, like I get it, right? Just give me another sign. I do that all the time to God, all the time. God, I feel like you're leading me here. Would you just give me a sign? And then something crazy and inexplicable will happen. I'm just like, okay, God, that's awesome. Can you just give me one more so I know I'm 100% for sure? But in context, it's not innocent. These Pharisees have already seen signs. They saw hungry disciples cared for. They saw a withered hand restored. They saw the bruised and the weak gathered to Jesus. They saw a demon-oppressed man free just in this chapter. The issue is not that they don't have evidence. The issue is that Jesus doesn't work on their terms. A restless heart can stand in front of the work of God and still ask God to prove himself. Jesus says no sign will be given except the sign of Jonah. Yes, there is, I think, a very clear resurrection connection here where Jesus talks about Jonah being 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish and the Son of Man being 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. I would love to spend a whole episode and talk about resurrection. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He talks about Nineveh. And he says Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah, and someone greater than Jonah is here. And then he talks about the queen of the south, which is, Sheba, and saying that she came from the ends of the earth to hear Solomon's wisdom. And someone greater than Solomon is here. And Jesus is responding by confronting them, by showing that outsiders, both in Nineveh and the Queen of Sheba, responded with less light than you have. Nineveh repented. Sheba came to seek wisdom. And the Lord of the Sabbath is standing in front of you and you're demanding more signs. It really is a warning. Sometimes we say things like we're waiting on God, but really we're resisting what God is already doing. Sometimes we want more proof because we don't want to surrender to the proof we already have. And sometimes Jesus will give us the image of the unclean spirit returning to a house that is empty, swept, and put in order. A house that is empty. House that is swept, put in order. It looks clean, but it's still empty. It's a haunting thought. That is false rest. It's moral improvement without surrendering. It's religion without the presence of the Spirit. It's being cleaned up without Jesus. And true rest is not a swept house. True rest is a life inhabited by Jesus. And that brings us back to those two words I told you at the beginning of the episode, Shabbat and Nuach. We do not stop just to be empty. We do not stop just to have a clean and swept house. We stop, we Shabbat, so that God can dwell with us. We stop striving so that we can settle, so that we can Nuach into his presence, and we receive his rule. Sometimes it's not about needing more signs, but so often it's about needing softer hearts. And Matthew will end this chapter with a family scene. At first, I think it feels disconnected, but it's actually, I think, a perfect landing place. Because the rest that Jesus brings is not just freedom from something, it's belonging with someone. And again, I think this is another section that we could so often just spend a lot of time on. The identity of a family and what that can look like. In this last story, Jesus' mother and brothers are outside, asking to speak with him. Someone will tell Jesus, hey, your mother and brothers are standing outside and they want to speak to you. And Jesus asks an odd question. Who is my mother and who are my brothers? And then he looks at his disciples and says, here are my mother and brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and my sister and my mother. At first, that sounds harsh. But I think as you look at the chapter as a whole, I think you see it as an invitation. Jesus is forming a new family around the will of his Father. The rest Jesus brings is not isolation, it's belonging. See, Jesus doesn't just free us from burden or bring us liberty from what was holding us captive. He does not just restore what is withered, or he doesn't just handle bruised reeds gently or bind the strong man or fill the empty house. He brings us home into the family of God. The rest of Jesus, the rest, capital R, the capital rest of Jesus does not leave us alone. It settles us into the family of God. Matthew 12 is not just a chapter about Sabbath debates. It's a chapter about the kind of rest Jesus brings and the question of whether you will receive it. Whether we look at the religious burdens that have been placed on us and where we need rest from that. Whether it's this idea that either we're withered or that we have someone in life is withered and so much of our rest is spent trying to not see that. Maybe we're a bruised reed or a smoldering wick. Maybe there have been powers that bind us and we need freedom from that. Maybe we are looking for signs from Jesus and missing the one he had already given us or not seeing it. And so how do we practice rest? Excuse me. I don't think the point of Matthew 12 is to read it and walk away with a new list of Sabbath rules. That's how the chapter starts. Jesus pushing back on a bunch of guys who have pointed Sabbath rules. The point is not, here are 5 ways to make sure you Sabbath correctly. There was my baseball announcer voice, if you haven't heard that one before. The point is, because Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, we are invited to become people who practice his rest. So this week, I want to ask you 3 things. Where do you need to stop? Where do you need to Shabbat? Where are you striving and proving and controlling and producing and reacting and carrying and whatever else when it comes to ing words that we are working that Jesus didn't give us? That's Shabbat. Stop it. Stop it. For one day this week, stop it. Put it down. Stop working. Stop controlling. Stop reacting. Stop producing. Stop proving. Stop carrying. Stop doing the things that Jesus didn't give us. Put it down. Where do you need to stop this week? Number 2, where do you need to settle? When I do stop, when I actually put things down, are you settling into God? Or are we just distracting ourselves in a different way? Because if we're settling into God, that's nuach. So I encourage you this week, stop. And then settle into his presence. Settle into his rule. Settle into the truth that God is God, and I'm not. And lastly, who around you needs to experience the rest of Jesus because I follow Jesus? In other words, where do you need to share rest? Is there someone withered who needs restoration? Someone bruised who needs gentleness, someone bound who needs freedom, someone empty who needs presence, someone alone who needs family? Because Sabbath was never meant to stop with us. Jesus gives rest, and then he makes us people who extend rest into the world. So this week, where do you need to stop? And when you do stop, where do you need to settle? And once you've settled, who do you need to share that with? Matthew 12 shows us that Jesus is the rest we were made for. He's the rest from religious burdens. rest that restores what is withered, rest for the bruised and the burnt out, rest from the powers that bind us, rest that fills the empty, and rest that brings us home into the family of God. So this week, don't just take a break. Come to Jesus. Stop striving. Settle into his presence. Receive his rule. And then, if we're going to be dusty, we have to become the kind of person who carries his rest into a restless world. And this will set us up really well for next week, Matthew 13. Because in chapter 12, we see that not everyone receives the rest of Jesus the same way. Some are restored by him, some are amazed by him, some accuse him, some demand more signs, some stand outside. And in Matthew 13, Jesus begins to teach in parables about soil, seed, and the different kinds of hearts that respond to the kingdom of Jesus. Next week, we're going to ask, what kind of soil are we becoming? But this week, take a break. Stop doing and working, thinking, proving, controlling. Put down those burdens he didn't give you and settle into his presence a little bit more this week. And once you feel that, why don't you share it with someone else? Until then, let's keep walking with Jesus. Let's keep getting dusty. And may the dust of our teacher, our Savior, our Rabbi, our King, Jesus, cover you this week. Thank you so much for spending your 30 minutes with me today. I hope you have a great rest of your week.